All right, my name is Charles Mudd, and I am pleased to welcome a number of colleagues to talk about the space regulatory environment here today. And I'll begin with myself. I'm principal of Mudd Law, and coming up on October 1st will be 20 years, the firm's anniversary. And we've been focused on internet and technology law for all of that time. And over the last several years, that's expanded into space law. Additionally, I have the pleasure of working with and having on the panel here Chris Johnson, who happens to be the space law advisor at the Secure World Foundation, as well as an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University. We have Dr. Andrew Williams, who happens to be the External Relations Officer at the European Southern Observatory, ESO, which is an intergovernmental organization for ground-based astronomy. Andrew is responsible for government relations and also represents the organization at UN Copius. Prior to ESO, he worked for over a decade as senior policy advisor for NATO and as a physicist for the government of the United Kingdom. He holds a degree in physics and a doctorate in public policy. And we have the pleasure of joining with us here today, Julianna Rotella, Global Expert Group on Sustainable Lunar Activities, Implementation Support Officer and Space Law and Policy Project Group co-lead for the Space Generation Advisory Council. And, you know, it's a pleasure to have the three of you on this panel with me for a number of reasons. One, I enjoy working with all of you, but we also have been working together on particular groups focused on a specific aspect of space policy that we'll dive into later, and that relates to the effect of satellites on astronomy and the broader kind of global governance in that regard. So I think that we'll end up having a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to it. So I guess, you know, there's been a lot going on in terms of the United States regulatory environment with respect to space. Over the last few years, a number of the applicable agencies have overhauled their regulations or improved their regulations, depending on one's perspective, with respect to space-related matters. That includes the Federal Aviation Administration. Most recently, the Federal Communications Commission implemented new regulations addressing space debris in the context of satellite operators, satellite manufacturers and operators engaging in efforts to mitigate space debris, which is a significant concern. And the FCC has also streamlined its regulations for small satellite commercial operators. What that means, of course, is trying to open up the opportunities for new players in the commercial space sector. Is just a very quick example. The FCC's licensing fee for, let's say, a satellite license reduced from about $400,000 to around $30,000 for a small sat operator that fits into those categories. And that's a significant drop and opens up the market for a number of players. But that also raises issues because then, of course, the more satellites that are out in space, the more we have space debris issues. And another issue, as we mentioned, or I mentioned earlier, is astronomy. We're going to talk about the United States regulatory environment, but in so doing, I think we also need to recognize that there's the international component. And so, Chris, I want to turn to you first, and both you and Andy have experience with COPUOS, the United Nations, but I want to turn to you first, Chris, and kind of if you can give us a context of, you know, beyond what goes on in the US and the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, the Federal Communications Commission, where do you see, or how do you see the current international policy framework focused on space? How does that how does that work, and how does COPUS come into play in that?
Well, thank you for the question, Charles, and thanks to everyone for organizing this and for inviting me. To get right into it, outer space is a shared domain. It is a domain outside of state territory. That reality of international law and international relations has been known since the 50s. 1958, creation of the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or COPUOS, with its two subcommittees, scientific and technical, and the legal subcommittee. Um, you know, sh- uh, Shared issues of governance of space activities are discussed there. This is the home of the space law treaties, which do some, go some way towards regulating, let's call them mega constellations or global constellations. Um, when we look at the treaties, we don't see a whole lot, but we do see in some indicators and some pointers. We see Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, which speaks of due regard. States shall show due regard to the corresponding interest of other states in the exploration and use of outer space. So not total regard or absolute regard, but some amount, some regard which is due, some quantum, some regard for the shared corresponding interest of other states. Article 9 also talks about harmful contamination. We don't know what harmful means, but those elements in Article 9, harmful contamination, a prohibition on harmful contamination, a obligation of due regard, an obligation of international consultations, they show some type of environmental awareness for the space domain. And these issues continue to be discussed in slightly disconnected fashions at COPUOS, and I mean that is that there's a number of agenda items at COPUOS that kind of touch on this topic. There's an agenda item at Legal Subcommittee, international law applicable to small satellites. There's another one on space traffic management. Hopefully soon there will be a specific agenda item on mega constellations and their effect on astronomy and their effect, shared users of the space domain. I think what's important to point out is that mega constellations, global constellations, the utility of them is a legitimate, lawful use of outer space. It is one permissible use of outer space. Another, likewise permissible use of outer space is astronomy, ground-based astronomy, space-based astronomy. These are both shared. They're equal activities, equally lawful activities, and there's nothing that we have in space law that shows us how to balance these. No activity predominates or takes precedence over either of those activities. So we have this growing awareness that these discussions need to happen at COPUOS, and we're watching this very closely.
Thank you. And, that leads then to asking Andy a question in representing the ESO, European Southern Observatory at UN COPUOS on that astronomical perspective. But Andy, before I turn to you, I want to add one additional aspect to what Chris indicated, just as a side note before we pass by it. And that's, talking about the harmful impact to other aspects of space. And what's interesting within the United States is that NASA does, that our government does focus on planetary protection, and that's both ways, right? On one hand, we don't want to bring back contaminants from other celestial bodies to the United States that could be harmful. But the more intriguing and interesting that I think a lot of people don't know is that we're also focused on ensuring or trying to ensure that we don't, in our space exploration, introduce contaminants to other celestial bodies and possibly affect the discovery of, we don't want to kill off the very discovery of life that we've been looking for. But Andy, jumping on Chris's comments relating to UN COPUOS and that kind of dialogue of the commercial satellites in one aspect and then astronomy in another, that dialogue, what are your perspectives on that?
Thanks, Charles. So it's interesting that astronomy in a way is the original space activity. And, it's something that's not so often discussed at COPUOS. I mean, it occasionally comes up. So we've documented a few instances over the past 50 years where it's been discussed, but it's often referred to over and over and again as a sort of rationale for why we're in space, the value of exploring space, the benefit of all humankind, the fundamental curiosity about the vast scope of our universe, and then the value of exploring questions like, is there life out there in the cosmos? And of course, now we know, thanks to astronomy, that actually, on average, every one of the trillion stars in our universe, likely has a planet around it, at least one. So there's many opportunities for life, and I think that this new situation with the growth of satellite constellations has really started to kind of raise the question of the impacts on astronomy, and we're now seeing one of the first kind of substantive discussions at the committee. And I think it's also an interesting thing because it's shining light on the overall problem of how our space sector or space economy is actually governed, and how the Earth's orbital environment is governed. And it's this is like another way to shine a light on this problem. So I think that the work that we've started in the past couple of years, since May 2019, when SpaceX launched their first Starlink satellites, so we've really started to make some progress, although there's still work to be done.
Along that line, all four of us are currently participating in planning on working groups for the Dark and Quiet Skies conference that various international organizations are involved with. That was planned to be physically and hybrid in Las Palmas, and we received notification that won't physically take place. But Andy, you are chairing the national section, but Juliana, you're chairing the international section of the policy working group focusing on that. And what do you see? Like, do you see a lot of concern across countries? So that is it just the UK-US concern that meets at UN, or are you finding that there are multiple countries and a widespread international concern about the effect of mega constellations, satellite constellations on astronomy?
Thank you, Charles, for your question. And no, definitely, it's not just a few countries. You could also see during the last Scopus session, especially of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, how many countries issued statements on the preservation of dark skies and the need to consider the impact of these new satellite activities on astronomy. And these kind of for like the Dark and Quiet Skies conference are super important because are bringing together all the different visions that have not been considered until now. So until now, we had a discussion, international discussion in a body, the Scopus, where most of the delegations are governmental delegations. So you also have observers, but the real members are countries. So through these conferences, we are able to bring together the perspective of scientists, the perspective of private actors that are not being included in these international discussions, the perspective of different governments. And so also going back to the question of the balance that Chris mentioned before, we need to find the balance, but this balance can be only found through a discussion that puts together all the different stakeholders and is able to understand what are the interests of these different people, different actors, and find the real balance and a real preservation of astronomy and the sustainable use of space for satellite operators.
So Chris, I want to turn to you for a moment and to give us some context on the process. And sometimes it's called a bureaucratic process in terms of how much time elapses, how much time it takes to get something done. For example, in the United States, we first started looking at space debris, which, in the US, we like the term orbital debris, one and the same. Back in 1993, the White House first started taking a look at it, and we finally depending on one's perspective, finally are really getting substantive regulations in 2020, 2021, a long time after that. So when we look at the UN perspective and we look at COPUS and trying to get the UN General Assembly eventually to even look at this kind of issue, what kind of a timeline are we looking for? Are we looking for a new space treaty? Is there a need for that, or is there something less that's more approachable?
So these are great questions. You know, I'll briefly say that the Outer Space Treaty, once they decided to turn the Principles Declaration into a binding instrument, they did it in 1 year, 1966. The 1968 Astronaut Rescue and Return Agreement was completed within 5 months of negotiating. Once they decide to do something, and they feel an urgency, they can do it. Although that 68 rescue agreement was done in contemplation of the moon landings, the crewed moon landings. However, treaty making has slowed down at the UN. We all know this, and it has taken a step back from treaty making. You know, when we look at recent deliverables from COPUS, say the last 20 years, we do see a slowing down. Although the 2007 orbital debris mitigation guidelines from COPUS were done within a few years, the latest deliverable is the long-term sustainability guidelines that took around 10 years from initiation of a working group to deciding that there should be a formal full process. That long time reflects the size of the committee at 95 member states, now at 99. Now, hopefully next year with the new application from Kuwait that would bring COPUS to 100 member states. So therefore, it's one of the largest consultative bodies within the United Nations system. So it does take a long time compared to, you know, what an industry could develop or what can be done on a contractual level. But there are benefits to taking that long time. You know that when you've got to the end of it, that you have buy-in and a consensus from all of those member states, 100 member states, including the traditional space powers, the middle space powers, the emerging space powers. You know that all of them have signed off and acquiesced and agreed to what is there. And it's done in an open and formal process with the the imprimatur of the UN machinery. So what we would look at for something like this, what I would consider a success coming out of COPUS on this topic, this discrete topic of, global constellations and astronomy, I would like to see, I could see a successful 3 to 5 year work plan where at the end of it, we don't have a treaty, but we do have something that has some normative force. So a principles declaration, some type of guideline, or something that could be included in an annex and then sent up for approval by the UN General Assembly. I think that this matter is too specialized for the General Assembly itself, though. The General Assembly, delegates discussions of this nature would be the correct forum for it is at COPUS, though. So 3 to 5 years, and I think that's when we look at space activities, that would be fine. This is how long space activities, even operations and launch programs, it's comparable timelines.
Thanks, Chris. That definitely provides some context, and I want to pick up on two things that you mentioned in that. One is the word urgency. And it's better. I'm glad to hear that we're not looking at 10, 20 years for something. And I really appreciate the perspective that, once the UN decides to do something, they can get something done. But let's focus on the word urgency for a moment. And Andy, I'm going to turn to you in a moment and talk about whether you believe that satellites affecting astronomy happens to be an urgent issue, or this is something that is a concern of people over in the corner, and we don't really need to focus on it. But before I do, I want all of you to kind of think about the collaboration between industry. Giuliana, you mentioned, people coming together, industry, policymakers, or people interested in policy, the astronomy community. I was on a panel recently, and I guess I came across too optimistic for somebody that misinterpreted what I was saying as being that there was no need for new regulations, that there was no need for any work. And the context of that came out of my experience being in SatCon and participating in SatCon and Dark and Quiet Skies, and that I have been impressed with the way that there are some industry representatives involved, that there are some, there are people from diverse sectors coming together and trying to reach a solution, which oftentimes you don't hear about. In the news media, you often hear about people fighting one another and arguing, and there may be differences, but I was trying to convey a positive outlook. I did not want that to come across as that, I was optimistic that everything's fine and the way it happens to be. But turning back, Andy, urgency. Before you comment on, that kind of collaboration and cooperation and so forth, but urgency, is this an urgent issue with the effect of satellite constellations on astronomy?
So I think in general it is, and this is due to the scale of these systems. I mean, if you total up the full deployments of Starlink, of Kuiper, of OneWeb, and the Chinese system, I mean, this is approaching 80,000 satellites in low Earth orbit. And assuming that those four projects have a reasonable chance of actually succeeding, because of course we know that many space projects don't succeed because it's very difficult, and the companies encounter financial difficulties, etc. But I think those four projects do actually have a realistic chance of succeeding. So this would mean an appreciable change in the appearance of the night sky. Now, we can have a debate on whether that's a problem or not, but from the perspective of certain types of astronomy, it is a massive problem, particularly for those wide field telescopes that are looking at large portions of the sky, and for those science cases that need to look low on the horizon at twilight, which is when many of these systems will be visible. And then there's another factor. So, in the previous decades, a radio astronomer could find a very remote area of Earth, and they could build a radio observatory, and they could make local agreements with the local government to create a radio quiet zone, and they can look across the entire radio spectrum, outside of the bands that have been allocated to radio astronomy under the International Telecommunications Union. And now, of course, there's a situation where if these 80,000 satellites are deployed, there will be between 3,000 and 5,000 satellites over the horizon at any one time, at any point on Earth, depending on the latitude. And presumably these 3,000 to 5,000 satellites will be transmitting in the radio spectrum. And of course, this creates a massive headache for radio observatories, and represents a substantial loss in their capability over certain portions of the spectrum. So, if we think, well, these projects are going to be there in a 10 to 15 year timescale, then yes, this is an urgent problem. And also bear in mind that the timescale of a major astronomical observatory is sort of on the 30 to 50 year timescale. So
yeah,
it creates a problem.
And I was talking with a colleague from the International Dark Sky Association who was pointing out a report that I guess has come out that even aside from the satellite streaks that appearing in images, and there's a DCAM image that is out there that's become very popular of that the satellites themselves and the number of the satellites projected will create kind of just a glow that could decrease the darkness of the night skies generally, and that's a scary phenomenon. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, and my dad describes growing up on a farm and being able to walk outside every day and seeing the Milky Way galaxy. The suburbs of Chicago, that's not something that you see. I had to go to Yellowstone to see that. And to think that we might lose even the darkness that exists now generally is a concern. Juliana, you are also focused on sustainable lunar activities, and the word sustainable is used a lot in terms of space because we want a sustainable orbit, we want a sustainable space environment. Can you kind of elaborate on that concept of what we mean when we talk about sustainable in a space context?
Yes, and I want also first to go back 1 second to the question on the urgency and the timing of international lawmaking, because the fact that these issues are urgent also for the sustainability of lunar activities or the sustainability of activities in low Earth orbit doesn't mean that there is an urgency to create new laws, because we have the Outer Space Treaty. We need the practice to catch up with the law. We need a good way of implementing the principles that we have. We doesn't need to have a new treaty, for example. We just need to make sure that those principles that we have are implemented based on the new issues that are emerging, that are the sustainability of the low Earth orbit or the coexistence of activities on the moon. And sustainability means that we need to make sure that space will be accessible also for first actors that now don't have the capabilities of accessing space, but also for future generations, not meaning in the 10 years from now, in 20 years from now, but in 100 years from now. For me, a sustainable use of space will mean that we are making a use of space now that will allow people in 100 years from now to use it and access it in the best possible way. And I think there is a general interest now also in general also within the United Nations on the importance of intergenerational equity. We had the last week, I think it was published, the new agenda of the UN Secretary, our common agenda, that proposed the creation of this UN Declaration on Future Generations. And actually, in our space system, we don't have any reference to future generations apart from the moon agreement. That is the only one that is mentioning, I think, at Article 4, if I'm not wrong, or Article 11, the importance of future generations. And sustainability means that. And it also, if you look, for example, even a constitutional law, the importance of future generation is emerging always more with the concern on the environmental emergency. So we have an environmental emergency on Earth, and we will have an environmental emergency in space if we are not able to take care now of how space will look for the future generations.
Well, on the sustainable issue, I think that a lot of people lose sight of the fact that, let's just talk about the number of satellites in low Earth orbit. Space is big, but it is particularly, even around the Earth's orbit, the orbital space is large, it's vast, but it is finite. And when you consider the speed at which satellites are orbiting the Earth, 17,000 kilometers an hour, basically able to orbit the Earth in an hour and a half, you start to have tens of thousands of satellites. That's a huge potential for conjunctions or collisions is another way of looking at it, the debris issue. And it certainly can come to a point, the Kessler effects or Kessler Syndrome suggests that it could come to a point where low Earth orbit particularly becomes unnavigable. So essentially it becomes, then it's affecting commercial activity. So the commercial sector, I think, definitely should pay great attention to the sustainability issue. But I want to go to something that you said at the beginning there, because I think that a lot of times in law, it's your indication that there are principles that already exist. There is the Outer Space Treaty, that we have that we don't need something more necessarily. It's like you have to tread that argument very carefully, right? Because if you make too strong a case that we already have what we need, then there are those that would say, well, all right, good, you have what you need, we don't need anything more, right? And I think it's a balance, because yes, we want to make the argument that we already have the ability to regulate and control and make sure that certain things happen and don't happen, but we also need something more to make that more explicit and to talk about that. So Chris, on that point, can you provide your thoughts on, what is the balance between what we have right now, what we need, and how you see that forthcoming over the next few years?
A tough question. The Outer Space Treaty, the title is a treaty on principles. So it's a treaty on principles governing the activities of states. And therefore, when you look at it, if there's this idea in international law about the grain of international law, that if you continue to ask more and more precise questions, at some point the law doesn't give you a clear answer. If your question is broad, are states responsible for their national activities? You can get an answer. The Article 6 says yes, they are. But if you ask a very detailed question, like are global constellations in violation of the due regard principle of Article 9? There you're performing both treaty interpretation and honestly, my approach to this is one of modesty. The treaty does not give a clear answer, and that's fine. In fact, the right answer is that it doesn't give a clear answer, and therefore we work from the broad principles that we have, and then we know that we have to refine and clarify and elucidate them. International space law is an open system, and this was known since the 60s. The Rescue Agreement expands on Article 5 of the Outer Space Treaty. The Liability Convention expands on Article 6 and 7. The Registration Convention expands on Article 8. Maybe we need to expand on Article 9 and come up with some type of space environmental framework, perhaps in treaty form, perhaps otherwise. So it is not a defect of space law that it doesn't give a clear answer on precise questions, but it is encouragement that we need to, continue working on these things. And this is fine. There's plenty of room for and opportunities for space lawyers in the years to come, I would say.
And that's good news to the young law students that are interested in space law. Andy, Juliana, before we go further, I want to circle back to an issue of collaboration. And both of you currently chair, as I mentioned earlier, aspects of the Dark and Quiet Sky Conference Policy Working Group subgroups. How do you see the collaboration among people in different sectors? How have you seen that, not only in Dark and Quiet Skies, but also SatCon? Could you comment on the variety of players that have come together to address this issue, and whether that's been a success or whether you've seen people from diverse areas interested in reaching a solution?
So I think it's been a great success so far, in the sense that we have brought together a number of experts, from astronomers to satellite constellation designers, to space lawyers and policy experts, and it's been a truly fascinating project in the past 2 years. And I think I'd just like to sort of focus on the interaction with industry. So several of the companies, to their credit, have actually tried to engage with the astronomy community in a meaningful way, and to the extent of deploying resources. So I think it's widely known that SpaceX effectively redesigned their satellites and added new components to try and address these concerns. And some of the companies have various types of bilateral agreements with certain observatories, or have made agreements with their national government to, for example, to avoid certain areas, to not broadcast their transmissions in certain areas where there's a radio observatory located. And this is all great. And it's a positive example from the industry side of showing some kind of corporate responsibility. But then, the bigger question is, as we see a growth in the number of companies, and we see an increase in projects with the backing of states from outside the US and Canada and the kind of Western world, it then begs the question, well, will all these projects also collaborate with the astronomy community? Will they be as forthcoming? And then there's the kind of practical aspect that having to have multiple bilateral agreements, between all the different observatories and all the different companies. I mean, it's very inefficient. So ideally, we would have, some harmonized way of dealing with this, and that's something that the astronomy community is starting to work on. So the International Astronomical Union has put out a call for a new center to try and coordinate the entire global astronomy community to deal with this problem, and that's fine. But on the side of the space sector, I mean, there is no kind of harmonized approach to dealing with this. So I think that's one of the challenges that we're going to face. And I think it's the same type of challenge that we have on the space debris world, or the space traffic management, or the broader space sustainability question.
Yeah, so I guess a quick question, and maybe it's a quick answer, maybe it's not. Do you believe, as some in industry would suggest, not those that are necessarily participating in recent efforts, but in many diverse industries, there's a suggestion from within those industries that self-governance is all that you need. And I saw that with the internet, right? When the internet came out, the internet companies were saying, you don't need to regulate what we do. And in fact, there were efforts, and a lot of those efforts failed because it was regulating speech on the internet. So, but the internet companies would say, you don't need to regulate us, we're good, we'll control our own space. And then we've seen issues come up with, for example, Facebook and having congressional hearings in the US and so forth. So in my mind, self-governance does not work in and of itself. There's a place for it, perhaps, in my perspective. Do you, Andy, do you think that all that we need is the satellite industry to govern itself, and there's no need for legislation on both either a national or policy on an international level?
I mean, I believe that some aspect of self-governance, I think, is always going to be there. But I think that given the market forces and the political forces that are present in this particular sector, I think that some regulatory push is needed to actually compel the operators, with the appropriate type of government support and funding, and also backing. I think that is needed to control the problem. And of course, a concern that's raised is, well, the US or the UK will introduce some, very kind of tough regulations and then economically damage their industries in the process of doing so. And I think that's really where we need, strong action at the international level in exactly forums like COPUOS to really try and address this kind of race to the bottom problem.
So really it comes across that we really need efforts on multiple levels, right? The governance within the industry, national level, international level. Giuliana, do you have any comments on that? What's your perspective?
Actually, I think that the self-governance for corporate is important. Of course, it can be the only tool, but it's really important, because I remember back during SATCON 2 talking to a satellite operator about the fact that being a good actor is a market value. So it's something that can be spent with clients, with insurance, and that is what, for example, the space sustainability rating is doing. So giving points to space companies that are acting in a sustainable way. So it's also good for space actors to act in a good way, to use these actions as a marketing tool for their companies. So of course it needs some regulations, both at the national level, at the international level, but it is a good tool for a better sustainability of space activities, because it can be used. There is lots of green there are lots of green activities everywhere now for every company. It's not only in space. So it's really like something that in the market can work. So it's positive both for the side of the industry and for the side of satellite operators being a good actor, I believe.
Very good point. Chris, we have a question that I think that I think you'd be apt to answer. So taking a step away from astronomy for a moment, do you see an increase in private companies focused on cleanup, I'm presuming cleanup of the orbital environment, or deorbiting processes of the satellites? If so, how do you feel these agencies that we've talked about will have to coordinate with the owning nation? So do you see an increase in private companies focused on cleanup or deorbiting processes? And if so, how do you feel the agencies will have to coordinate with the owning nation?
All right, well, thank you for that. And I'll answer that question. I do have a few comments on your previous question. Basically, when I think about how much the private sector should be allowed to regulate itself, I'm reminded of the quote from another space lawyer, Frans van der Donk. It's a Dutch saying, apparently: "The butcher does not license himself." And what that means is, if you allow private entities to reap all of the rewards, yet place all of the risk, cleanup, externalities on the public sector, on everyone else, it will be very good for business in the short term, but this is precisely the perfect recipe for a tragedy of the commons situation, where private actors can do whatever they want to a shared domain, and come up with the rules that best serve them, but have consequences that affect all of us, and we don't get to share the benefits, but we all have to share the costs. So then getting to the second question about orbital debris, indeed there are business cases for orbital debris. There are companies looking at cleanup of orbital debris. It takes a variety of forms. Essentially, there's the major division is between, well, two major divisions. One is between the large debris and the small debris, and the other major division is between things which we know the launching state, we know who to ask permission from, and those objects which we don't know the launching state, we don't know who to ask permission from, and often, not all the time, but the small stuff is things where we cannot determine who the launching state is. So the good news is that the largest stuff where we can ask for permission, that may be easier, and that may be the first types of activities that we do when we do orbital cleanup. We, the deorbiting companies contract with the satellite operators and the owners, and they contract for end of life. We will remove your satellite. What's the rationale for doing that? Well, if you can remove your spacecraft from orbit, you've reduced the potential liability from it. States and corporations are internationally responsible for physical damage in space, and so you want to get your debris out of the way, your non-functioning spacecraft out of the way, and then you know that you're not exposed to any potential liability. So the operators and owners have that incentive to reduce their debris. They should remove their debris from orbit. To eliminate their liability, they should remove their debris from orbit. The case is different for the small stuff. And just like you can recycle big pieces of scrap metal, but there's not much of a market for, tiny pieces of trash. And there we're going to have to look at market incentives and really come up with how can we incentivize that and close the business case for those space sweepers,
And Chris, can I stop you there for a second? And talking about the small debris, I mean, just for the audience that is listening and that might be listening later, I mean, how, I can see a huge satellite having an issue colliding with another satellite, or let's say, a missile. India had the tests a few years ago that many in the international community thought was negligent and not smart in testing, whether it could take out its own satellite. And of course it could, but it created this huge debris field. How dangerous or how much of an issue are small pieces of debris?
Depends on the orbit. But even small pieces of debris can, because they are at orbital speeds, they can destroy or disable or damage your operating spacecraft. And it really depends on, spacecraft are not hardened to defend themselves from debris. And your solar sails, your transponders, your antennas, if they're struck by debris, now that's another piece of debris, your entire spacecraft. So there's the possibility for this debris on debris collision, what you refer to as the Kessler Syndrome. Yeah, small pieces of debris. You know, I'm not an astrodynamicist, but if it's a small piece of debris with that type of small cross section traveling through space, it's a different probability of that small piece of debris than something the size of a bus, which has a larger cross section. And so its probability of striking something is smaller. But guess what? The small stuff we can track and predict and model its orbit. The large stuff we can track and predict its orbit. The small stuff, it's a guess as to where it is and how much of it is up there.
Right. And, I've seen, modeling from the European Space Agencies and others about the amount of debris out there. I mean, the large pieces, that's one thing. And then you expand to pieces that are less than, let's say, a centimeter and a millimeter, and it becomes just a cloud around the Earth. We're at about midpoint or slightly past midpoint, and I don't want to go without allowing each of you to talk about your organization briefly, because this is a conference involving education. And I think it's important, when we have panels and so forth, it's great to have the speakers, but you all come from perspectives and you're representing organizations that have a place in developing these kind of policies or advocating for certain interests. So given that we were just talking, or I just mentioned Europe, Andy, why don't you talk briefly about the ESO and what that happens to be?
Sure, I can do that. So the European Southern Observatory is an intergovernmental organization for ground-based astronomy. So what this means is that there is a treaty that is signed at the level of national legislature. So it's approved by parliaments. And it establishes the organization and funds it with direct contributions from these countries. So we have 16 member states. They're currently all European states, and our main mission is to design and operate world-leading observatories for the benefit of the global astronomy community. And these observatories are currently located in the Atacama Desert in Chile, which is our host country. And the reason for that is because it's a very dark place, it's a very dry place, which is good for astronomical observations, and it's very remote. So there's not so many radio signals causing interference. And our current project at the moment is to build what's called the Extremely Large Telescope, which in telescope terms, is literally extremely large. So it's going to be the world's largest ground-based optical and infrared telescope with a main mirror of 39 meters across, and what's that? It's 120 feet or so for the US audience. And this is a regular mirror composed of 798 hexagonal segments, and all sorts of amazing engineering challenges, such as they have to keep this mirror to such a precision, within kind of nanometer scale precision on this huge 3,000-ton structure. And it has many science goals, but some of my favorite ones are to actually take images of exoplanets, so planets outside our own solar system, and to take spectra of the atmosphere of these exoplanets and look for signs of life. And so Charles mentioned one of the many things that we do in addition to building telescopes is we actually try and advocate for the science of astronomy. And so we have a permanent observer seat in the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And here our role is to generally advocate for the benefit of astronomy for humankind, to now kind of cast astronomy as a space activity. And this is something that's become very important now with the growth of satellite constellations. And yeah, so we're a European organization, but open to astronomers from around the world who can use all our facilities to do world-leading science.
And if somebody were wanting to find more information on ESO, what's the website that they can go to?
It's eso.org. Very simple.
Very simple. Giuliana, why don't you, because I think many people have not heard of the Space Generation Advisory Council. Could you explain a little bit about your organization?
Yes. So Space Generation Advisory Council was created in 1999 during Unispace 3 conference. And it is an organization in support of the mission of the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs for the peaceful exploration and use of outer space. So it has students and young professionals from all over the world. We have a representation in every region of the world, in every country, and there's different project groups that are working on specific topics. So I am the co-lead of the Space Law and Policy Project Group that actually I think was founded by Chris a few years back. And we have several projects. We have projects on disarmament, project on the implementation of the LPS guidelines, on satellite satellite constellations, on the impact, on the use of Earth observation for monitoring human rights, and several other projects. And we are all volunteers. We meet usually during the weekends, but I have always my Saturdays full of these meetings. But it's super interesting because we come together, interview experts, create reports. We had several presentations at UN Corpus, so it's really a way of bringing the view of the new generations at the international level, but also at the national. So, for example, one of our biggest projects now is the US Task Force on Space Legislation, and we have been working on different policy memos, one on space debris, one on space diplomacy, and different other topics, and presenting this policy memo to the US congressional people or congressional staffers. So we really are trying to study the space law and policy and find the best ways of implementing it at the national and international level.
Very interesting, and I appreciate all that you do as well, Andy. And Chris, Juliana mentioned you've had long involvement in space-related issues and so forth, but could you expand or explain to the audience a little bit about the Secure World Foundation?
Yes, certainly. Thank you. So Secure World Foundation, SWF, is a non-governmental organization, a privately endowed non-governmental organization, NGO, which is headquartered in the United States, but tries to have an international reach, even though we have a very small staff. And, as an NGO, which is focused on space sustainability, peaceful uses of outer space, prevention of conflict or prevention of an arms race in space, and the use of space for human and environmental security here on Earth, what we do is really act as a convener between different stakeholders, as a trusted convener that can get different stakeholders with different interests and different issues in the same room, do some type of capacity building with everyone else in the space industry, and we work with organizations precisely like SGAC and European Southern Observatory and elsewhere around the world, because they are often the experts, and we really want to hear from those experts and hear some of the issues that they have. So we do what we can to act as an NGO and try and foster and act as norm entrepreneurs. So we know that there's the idea that we should be preserving space or that we should be remediating debris. And we have to act to continue to socialize and expand the people who agree to some of those norms.
Thank you all for providing that information. And I forgot to ask Juliana the website for her organization, but she posted it in the chat, and that's spacegeneration.org, and a particular link /projects/space-law-policy. And Chris, if somebody wants to learn more about SWF, where do they go?
SWFOUND, so swfound.org.
Great. We do have a couple other questions from the audience, and I'm going to just throw it out there without picking anybody in particular. So jump in. How are the regulatory agencies working to combine public and private sectors?
I mean, this is a tough one because it really depends on the perspective from different regulators, and I would I would guess that folks at the FCC take a different approach from folks at the FAA. Or Department of Commerce. I mean, really, the first challenge is to get different government agencies to be operating on the same level and speaking the same language and taking the same approach. You know, I let's say in the context of global constellations and astronomy, I don't think there is much formal cooperation between public and private sectors on this, or it essentially just matters down to the consultative process, something more than the interagency process between governmental actors. They also have to have, the availability, the openness to hear from the uninvolved public and to hear from industry and to have, these meetings. I mean, in the US, there's so many open forums for some of these activities. There's the NASA Advisory Council, advisory committees. There's the FAA ComStack. There's the streaming of the, White House Space Council. There's, congressional hearings. You see all these different forums where these discussions happen, and they're going to continue to happen. I would love to see. I think I've only heard once of a similar streaming happening in the UK where you could tune into something in the House of Commons and watch a debate on space. But I would love to watch those things and learn how space governance happens elsewhere around the world. And the polycentricity is what we're looking at here. How do these discussions happen?
Andy or Juliana, do either of you have a comment from your perspective? That's not necessarily US, but just in your individual countries, or a broader perspective on the interrelationship between public and private sectors?
I think now, we are seeing always more a collaboration of public and private sector. And even if the private sector, for example, was not involved in the international conversations before, we are seeing now these multilateral fora that are way more flexible than before. For example, GEGSLA, that is the one that I'm part of, is one of these organizations that is trying to bring together the public and the private sector, civil society. So it's not even only public and private sector, but it's really, I think now in the regulatory process, bringing together all the different stakeholders. So that can be scientists, can be satellite operators, what we were saying before. So I think at the regulatory level now, there is the need for having these flexible organizations that brings together all of these different issues and are able to provide a guidance for new regulations. And I think, for example, there are the standards agency. They work with different committees that bring together governmental representatives, private operators. I think, for example, the ESO organization is working with these different committees that have representatives from all the different sectors and create standards based on the needs of the different sectors.
Andy, anything? Not to put you on the spot.
Well, I think Chris and Giuliana very well answered this, but I mean, just to sort of highlight that there's, I think, a general feature that we see that governments tend to prioritize national industry, and this is often the kind of dominant political narrative that we have. So, from the perspective of the concerns of astronomy, we're sort of faced with this political dynamic that the needs, for the space economy in these countries is, very strongly prioritized.
We're running up nearly at the conclusion, and there are a couple other questions that I want to get to, and I also want to allow each of you to provide additional comments. But before we do, I mentioned earlier the Dark and Quiet Skies conference coming up that was going to be hybrid, a physical meeting in La Palma, Spain, And I mentioned that the physical meeting has been canceled, and that's due in part due to the recent volcanic activity and the efforts of that local community. And so I just want to say all of our thoughts are with the local people there, and wish them well, and getting everything back operational as quickly as possible. So I'm going to try to hit these questions and then give you all the opportunity for a final comment. All right, so do power security politics get in the way of space regulation? Do the great space powers seek to prevent regulations that contain their scope for agency, while middle emerging space powers are the ones pushing for regulation and legislation? I have my own perspective, and I think that beyond dark and quiet skies, the United Nations has had, and UNUSA has had, some great conferences on space law and policy, where the United States is certainly there, and the United States and the other large space powers definitely have a dominating influence. But I don't believe, from my perspective, that it's just the emerging space countries that seek regulation. I think that we all, meaning all of our countries, Earth globally, need a systemic and kind of global management of the space environment. But I think that that's a good question for each of you to comment on. But Chris, I'm going to throw it first to you.
Yeah, short answer is yes and yes. I mean, all the geopolitical rivalries that exist in other domains also affect space discussions. If a great power A suggests something at COPUOS, you can bet that great power B will be against it, or hesitant or suspicious of it, merely because it has been suggested by great power A, rather than what is substantively in there, whether it is a good thing, whether it reflects long-term interest or values. So this dynamic is known, and which is why the middle powers or emerging powers or G77 powers have a disproportionate ability or efficacy to affect change at the COPUOS system. Some of the best initiatives have came from those middle powers that suggest something, and other middle powers are not suspicious of what they suggest as much as they would have been if it had been suggested by a great power. So I can think of a number of states, let's say Austria or Brazil or Belgium, around the world, really suggesting things and acting as a champion for particular topics. I would love to see a state or a number of states act as champions of this precise topic. And once there is a growing consensus among the rest of the world, the middle power states, emerging space states, the G77, then you will see the great powers acquiesce or allow consensus on some of those initiatives. And that's the dynamic at present. And I think it's workable. We can work with that.
That's a really good answer and a really good perspective. And one of our audience members agreed with a big thank you. Another question that has come up, that Andy or Juliana, did you have anything to add to what Chris commented there? All right. With the ongoing internet issues of expanding IoT tech, as with Google's AI interfacing with humanitarian issues and invasion issues, how will future self-governance in space and privatized tech be reflected as a tool versus potential hazard? And that is a mouthful of a question. Do any of you have any comments here in the last, and I'm going to limit you at this point to 30 seconds or so.
I was hoping you would answer that one, Charles.
I think that I think that it's a really interesting question. I think that going to a number of points that were raised, I think that if industry sees the potential to utilize technology in a positive way and see that potential as actually a marketing aspect. I mean, going back to something that Juliana, I think you said, that, looking at environmental aspects back in when environmental issues first came about, companies that had the foresight to adopt pro-environment technologies, I think, were ahead of the game. So I'm going to leave it at that for the moment, but that question is a very good question and one that I'll be thinking about. I'm running out of time here, but two issues that I really want to mention before we forget is there is an issue that's been debated and is debating across countries and across sectors, and that is whether or not Earth's orbital space is part of Earth's environment and whether it should be regulated as such. Within the United States, that happens to be an issue that's playing out in the courts right now. I would say that Viasat brought the action. Viasat has, I will say that I think that it's not just pro-environment concerns. There are underlying reasons for its lawsuit, but that is playing out. So I wanted to mention that. And with 3 minutes remaining, I'm going to turn it over to each of you. Final thoughts. Giuliana, we'll start with you. Do you have any final thoughts? And then those final thoughts, think about the fact that this is education. Do you have any thoughts for the young people out there?
Yes, okay. So I think what emerged from our conversation is that space governance is changing, is changed from where the space activities were only controlled by really a handful of states. Now we have new states in space, new actors. So there are different components that are influencing the space governance system, and the decisions that we are taking now will influence how we will be able to use space for future generations. So there is the need to make sure that once we are taking decision now, once we are creating guidelines now, we take care of the future generations, of a form of intergenerational equity, and this important starting from the younger generations now that will have an impact on the ones that are coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Giuliana. Andy.
Yep. So I think that, you know, some of the big questions that the future generations will have to solve will be this environmental question and how we regulate this new environment as humanity expands out to it. But it's also a question of economics. So, you know, how do we create a liability or an insurance system or a global fund for space debris cleanup, for example, or an intergovernmental organization that manages low Earth orbit slots? Another idea. So how do we deal with this kind of economic policy aspect? And then, you know, all the many interesting and challenging regulations that will be needed to deal with this issue.
I appreciate that perspective, and I couldn't agree more, Andy. Chris, final word?
I'll make it short. You know, there's plenty of space law to come. So go to the United Nations website, the USA website, download your copy of the treaty booklet. UN treaties on outer space from the Office of Outer Space Affairs. It's free. Have your own copy of the treaty booklet. Additionally, my organization has this handbook for new actors in space, which is also free as a PDF. That, you know, it's aimed for a more general audience, not just law students. So that's for free, and it'll teach you about international space law, national space law and policy, and sustainable operations. So plenty of work and thinking to be done in the future. Thank you for having me.
And I want to thank each of you for participating. I very much appreciate your perspective. I think I can speak for myself and you that we're out there. Feel free to contact us. Angelique, thanks for your assistance. And to CISA, thanks everybody, participants, audience, all the best. Be well.
Thank you, Charles.
Indeed, thank you.
Thank you.